Okay, before I start this podcast, we're going to ask people to kindly donate to my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/challenge history. And it's basically going to help my podcast as well as personal costs because I'm on disability. It goes a little bit more into the cost that it's meant to kind of help finance with my disability, as of other things as well. It starts at base levels of $1, $10, $25, $50, and $100 for the different tiers. At $50 and $100, when we reach a threshold of a few people, we will do the yearly giveaway of, at $50 it will be a Roman Empire silver coin, and at the $100 it will be a gold Byzantine coin that will be coming from American Precious Metals Exchange, which is where I buy my precious metals for rounds, coins, and bars, as well as other things of that sort. And for this podcast, we're going to be doing something a little bit kind of away from the normal political realm and going into kind of that idea of gaming. And we're going to kind of go over kind of mix of gaming and economics with what kind of made Sega kind of fail from an actual the idea of a console manufacturer. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what really caused it. Now most people are going to look at certain other things of what actually did it, and they're going to try to look at later mistakes with it. But to me, I think it really starts with a little bit before with it, and we're going to look at starting with the what was initially called the Mega CD outside regions of North America and Brazil, or what's called in by region, which would be called the Sega CD. Now I feel that this add-on with it was not essentially worthwhile, because essentially at the time that no one was doing any type of add-ons, even at the time. If you look at their competitors, no one was doing anything of the type, and they were still at the top of the game. When you look at its release, which was 1991, now if you look at in Japan and 92 in North America, and 93 in Europe, if you look at that time, that was essentially the heyday of 16-bit systems, so there was no legitimate usage for this, and being that it was an add-on, it was only going to put more strain on the system, and essentially for gamers, it was going with a U.S. price of nearly $300 for introductory price. It was going to basically cost them a lot more money. And you're talking that it's going to create the need for obviously the initial system, and then when you add it on, it's going to cause them to have to add on the additional connecting in cables, as well as a secondary power source. Which means to play this unit on a TV, you're going to have the power source for the TV, a power source for the Sega Genesis, and a power source for the Sega CD. Now the Sega CD was actually a standalone unit. It wouldn't be as much of a problem, but and they could have actually delayed. Now, if we look at a lot of the ideas, most of the games were actually a smaller screen, even though if you compare with some of the other ones, they were actually using a larger screen. Compared with Genesis ones, they were using the full screen, and this was using a limited screen in the center to accomplish what was available for the console market at the time. Essentially, it was basically not able to accomplish, not because they didn't have the technology to accomplish the CD on a much higher quality level at the time. Then when we go back, you'll see another problem, which was, if you look at the next, which is the 32X, you'll see another issue with it, which is, this is another thing where you basically put another thing on top of the thing, and this is about $160. Now, if you look at the initial price on the Sega Genesis, you will look at the initial price of that, which ends up being, where is that? Let's see if they show the initial price here. I'm not seeing the... But in many cases, it was not. They weren't that much. They were actually quite affordable, and they were essentially they were essentially quite affordable and quite. And led to the level of were essentially because they were released in Japan, and the Genesis was released in Japan in '88, North America in '89, Korea in '90, in Europe and Brazil in '90 as well, and that would be in September. So basically, in North America, it was already in August of '89 was released, but it really didn't hit being popular until about 90 or 91. And what what the benefit was it was essentially being essentially overtaking the NES, because the NES was the competitor at the time, and it was essentially because the graphics were so much better. And then if you compare that with if we look at the actual things with it, some people will actually take on some of the ideas of saying that their online service, the Sega Channel, was actually part of the downfall. I don't think it's much part of the downfall. I think that goes with it'll probably show us on here from a link from here. Yeah, network services. Yeah, and basically it was, and it was, they call it Sega MegaNet in there with it, depending on the area with it. It was basically, it worked on dial-up access with it, but it was essentially, most of the time it ran through, in many cases it ran through the things with it. And there was actually, and that was the initial thing with it. It created initially. That was the first. I guess the first one. The Sega Channel was its next thing that they ran through cable things, which essentially created later, and was essentially and essentially what we can actually liken to the idea of some of the new things of what we have today with some of the new streaming services for gaming now, and if we look at that, we can actually see that, and the download capabilities of games and some of these games that have add-on features in which you pay extra money for those add-on features, such as what Ubisoft is doing, and to try to keep their game prices down, and what it does, and to try to keep their games relevant much later past their actual date. Now, and what they would charge is about $13 a month. Now, this is essentially people would complain about, it was on the Genesis. Well, and it was later in their life. But the fact is, if we start to look at it, we can actually state that was essentially kind of breaking the mold of what it should have been, and that was really considered, in my opinion, a positive realm. Some people consider on the Saturn with it, but the Saturn really, what it should have been was essentially what the Sega CD was, and a mix of the Sega CD and the 32X. But because if we look at the 32X, we see with the 32X, the 32X was merely a system of gaming that was cartridge based, but the Saturn actually adopted it to CD based. Now when we start to look at the Saturn, we see that essentially is a standalone unit, very, very smartly adopted as a standalone unit. U.S. introductory price was about $399, which was at the time for next generation systems was actually smart. And this was essentially to go after the forthcoming Sony PlayStation. Now it did not reach its marketing share with it, but that's because the fact is I think that what they did is how they approached it, because they were doing too many things before that made people very, very suspect. And if we start to look at it, when they spent a lot of time in those add-ons, it made people very, very suspect in what the Saturn would be. And I think that damage in reputation did some problems with it. It's also they were not focusing as much on their legacy by really hammering forth on a lot of their legacy-based games that were coming from the previous models, and they weren't doing that as much. And when they did this, I think it hurt the Saturn's legacy, that they needed to come out of the gate, because we were still essentially in this mascot phase. And when you had Naughty Dog basically lining up with Sony with Crash Bandicoot, which is essentially becoming the mascot of Sega at the time, or of Sony at the time. Sega still Sega's always had Sonic as their mascot. Nintendo's always had Mario as their mascot. So when you have these things, you need to come right out of the gate. N64 came out with the Mario 64 right out of the gate, and you need to come out with a Sonic the Hedgehog thing and just start pounding with those ones, and pound with a very, very traditional Sonic. In that case, with a Sonic, it should basically be a transferring over to a 3D world type of Sonic, but still keeping a lot of these same aspects, just like Mario did. And that would have actually helped them with it. Now, I think some of the game selection was actually part of their problem with the actual system, because as you see with the controllers over here, you'll see that the actual view of the controllers, you can see that they adopted them just the same thing from what they had before. It wasn't like they did something obscure like the N64. If you look at N64, you'll see it was one of those alien style controllers that was completely different from what their previous system was. If you look at Nintendo on their systems, you will see next to this, you will see on their previous system, you will see that their controller was much different, and so there was in comparison, the Sega was actually was keeping up and keeping their ideas pretty simple. If you look at that, this is the USA model with it, which is pretty much identical to the Genesis model, which is it had the open, the power, had an access button. Let's see, I guess a cartridge input. I do not know what that's for. That's probably that might be for backwards compatible. For the previous system, most likely. I can probably check right now. Yeah, it seems it seems like it's basically extended it's for extended memory. And then there was a Sega Net link that was meant to plug there as well. When we look at that, So wasn't for backwards compatibility, but rather for memory addition and for plugging in for new additions for the system. And then the last one was the last party going into was the Dreamcast. We can see that it went into a new style controller, which was going into those almost alien style controllers. They had 4 controller slots. Now they were really kind of this is their last ditch effort into it. And I think they're really trying to almost emulate a lot of what some of the other competitors were doing, and this was really kind of almost copying, and this was really a bad move. And that switched them over to the system that was more designed on that eventually led them to the situation of software development. Now, it's not necessarily a bad move. It just means that they've basically have changed over. Now, does this mean that this is going to be they can't go back into it? No, not necessarily. But what ends up happening is that this is what ends up happening with companies now. What I see with it is that with the companies at one time, I think that you basically only listed 2 strong companies, and that a third company could be bumped at any time during an economic downfall. And since they end up and if you make mistakes in your company, you're going to have an economic downfall. Now, if you look at their competitors, and you can have things that are competitors that have actually all been wiped out. If you look at the major companies during the 1970s, all major and during part of the 80s, you look at most of those companies, they're all gone. You have Coleco, Mattel, and Atari are all gone from the console market. Yes, Atari's trying to jump back in with the new VCS system, which is I believe like a Bluetooth type of system that it's also supposed to work with wired controllers as well. But it's basically and it's going to be an online based system, online based console. But basically all of those ones are gone. And that's what we're talking about here is it can happen to any company. If we look at it right now, as you look at Microsoft and Sony are the current leaders, and Nintendo is struggling behind. While Nintendo was the leader, they're no longer that leader. If you look at Nintendo, they have done some mistakes, and they could do some mistakes in the past. Like if you look at yes, the NES was a definite plus. Yes, the SNES was a plus. But what they did, which was not a smart thing during their SNES period, was they did they're working with both Philips and Sony at the time. Philips released a CDI. This allowed Philips to create bad games on their products and their franchised items of both Mario and Zelda franchises. And if you compare, and then that gave Sony pretty much the exclusive right to basically take any piece on their essential SNES platform and use it for their new system, and pretty much have lifelong exclusive rights on those. And they pretty much sold that off, and that led to them having to change out the controller. There was essentially a great controller that they could have used on the next level, and that essentially scared off a lot of people from the N64 library, that they could have just essentially just altered this controller slightly to what basically the PlayStation 2 controller was developed to, and you can essentially see that they could have essentially created that, and it made them to have to essentially redesign something similar to the in the GameCube. They realized they made massive mistakes, but they even knew at that time that the N64 scared off a lot of their people, being that it was a poor controller design, and it created such negative feedback, and that allowed a lot of people to still kind of be negative on the GameCube. The Wii was essentially a positive thing with it, but the Wii U did not have the positive reception that the Wii U had with it. Now they've gone to the Switch, and the Switch is roughly a mix of a home and overseas console. And when we look at this, we can see that that they're not necessarily making the smartest decisions. And if we look at some of the other developments that they've had, we can see that they also had one of the ones in between was that's not often talked about, is the Virtual Boy. Now this is meant, or the VR32 when it was previous to being announced. And this was essentially a big problem. Like, you look at the history of the Virtual Boy right here. And it was essentially, it was basically made to be developed as this ability to have 3D technology, but the fact is it came in only red, and it was basically it was a very, very poor idea, poorly conceived. It had this monochrome display, unimpressive 3D effect. It's what it called basically high price. If you look at the, let's see if we get the price. It was about $180 with it, and the thing did not attach to your head with it. The what it called the battery pack was on the controller, and if the what it called which was meant to attach, which was meant to kind of keep it from keep it so it would stay on, and if you set the controller down, it could actually unplug your system. Now this is a massive problem, because if you want to relax your hands while you're playing and not keep them in an upright position, this is going to be a massive problem for most gamers, and that's why it was considered massively unpopular. And they needed, if they were going to do something with it, while there was a lot of hype under it, they needed to think about it first. And this is one thing where they could be the next one to be consolidated down, because while we are going to be coming into a economic crisis very, very soon, this is going to, and post-economic crises, that's usually when the next one to go is bumped off. And only time could tell how they're going to handle it. Now, they could be the first ones to pull through, but with the mistakes that they've made, it's caused them to have to rethink a lot of their systems. Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of these things, and they've done some really bad ideas. And it's considered the second lowest selling platform after the 64 DD, which is a special disk drive for the N64, which required you to own the N64, and it was only released in Japan. And that shows you how bad the Virtual Boy was, because that was released in Japan and North America. And it shows you how bad it was received. And we can see that that companies end up becoming massive failures, because we have even if they have good ideas with it, if they don't put forth a smart plan, they're going to fail. I mean, we have the ideas of TurboGrafx. TurboGrafx was essentially a North American failure, because they weren't putting forth. They didn't put forth the Top Hudson title, which was Adventure Island. I mean, that was not even on the system, and you would think that they would essentially take their top title and say, hey, we want this to be on our system to bolster our sales, because essentially in that 1980s 1990s mascot era, we want that to work, and especially with them being the first 16-bit system, they would have essentially said, we want to basically come out swinging. And yes, while they didn't have many third-party groups joining in on their system, they would have had to essentially make sure that they had as many first-party titles coming through. And I'm probably just going to end it right here. If you like it, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure you share it all around social media, to your friends and everyone else. Make sure you check my Patreon page. If you can't donate, make sure you give it to someone else, and I will do my best to get this up today. If not, I will get it up tomorrow on the the 9th or something. Bye, everyone.